business taxes. Was stressing about all the time and all the money you spent on your taxes.
This is my bill?
Now Business Taxes is a TurboTax small business expert who does your taxes for you and offers year-round advice at no additional cost, so you can keep more money in your business. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com/business. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service.
Acura's all-new ADX, a compact SUV that isn't just built for one thing. It's precision-crafted for everything. To escape the grind with available all-wheel drive. To go with your flow with available Google built-in.
Hey Google, turn it up.
Okay, turning up the volume. And crafted to be heard with an available Bang & Olufsen premium sound system. The all-new Acura ADX, crafted to match your energy. Acura, precision-crafted performance.
Take your vibes and go.
Google is a trademark of Google LLC.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show Dr. Elizabeth Norton. Welcome back, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure.
Well, today I'm so excited. We're recording this in March, but I think by the time it airs, it's going to be in April. But March is Women's History Month, and I thought of all of the historians that I know, you are the one who has really covered such a broad range of women in history. So to start off, I really want to know, what is your favorite period of history?
That's tricky. Yeah, I mean, personally, I think all periods of history are interesting. I mean, I would probably say the 16th century, because that's where I do the academic side of my work. But actually, I mean, I've always had a soft spot for the Anglo-Saxons, actually. In fact, because I did archaeology at university and was doing Anglo-Saxons. My master's dissertation was on the Anglo-Saxon sculpture of the South Saxon kingdom. So actually, maybe the Anglo-Saxons, they're fascinating.
They really, okay, so I have to know, what is it about them that fascinates you so much?
We're right at the start, really. I mean, it's the early medieval period. So the sources are fairly sparse and they're very kind of poetical. It's all very Tolkien-esque, and you have all these names that are quite unfamiliar. I mean, it's a period, and I mean, a lot of it's to do with the Norman conquest. So when Emma of Normandy came over to marry Ethelred the Unready, for example, in 1002, everyone went, "Oh, Emma, that's a really weird name. Never heard that. We're going to call you Elfgafu so we can say it." And it's this is a world where Elfgafu is a more sensible name than Emma. I love it, but it's absolutely fascinating because you get the state building, you get the birth of England, but some of the characters are really fascinating. I mean, it's a world where everyone's a saint, which is bizarre, because today it's quite hard to be a saint, but back then, you just have to be a bit holy. King Edgar, for example, in the 10th century, his mother's a saint, his first two wives are saints, his son's a saint, his daughter's a saint, his grandson's a saint. They're all saints. I mean, how amazing is that? It's very kind of, it's kind of a period of myth building, but it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned Emma of Normandy, and I just think she is amazing. Would you say like she is the first woman in history who you can look at and go, she had some power?
Yeah, so actually, I would say her mother-in-law, Queen Elfrith or Elfrida, is probably the very first. I mean, she's the first woman to be declared Queen of England that we know of, Elfrida, and to be crowned as Queen of England. So she's very much a model for Emma, I would say. We know more about Emma, largely because Emma published her own biography, effectively. She got someone to write the encomium Emma Reginae, which is all about how wonderful Queen Emma was. And he commissioned it, which helps. So we get this wonderful kind of Emma's point of view on everything. And nothing is ever her fault in this book, which is fabulous. But she's hugely powerful. I mean, she's the wife of two kings of England. She's actually not very powerful under Ethelred at all. She's really in the background. But when she marries Canute, she's almost a co-regent. She's there for everything, really, really powerful. And she's able to place her son Arthur Canute on the throne. And Edward the Confessor would never have become King of England without his mother Emma bringing him back. He's not very grateful for her, and he later confiscates all of her money and kind of sends her off to the countryside. But she's really, really powerful.
Yeah, I do want to talk briefly about this period in history because I'm fascinated with it, I guess. And, we have The Last Kingdom, which I think is the series that introduced a lot of people to this period in time. And to me, it seems like it was such a complicated or dangerous time to live when you have the people who were already here living in England, and then you have the Vikings or the Danes that are coming over. Maybe you could touch briefly on what society maybe looked like at that time or the fears that people may have had.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a small scale society. So although they do have the king in the center, actually, most people won't really be troubled by the king. They live in their villages, they farm, get a lot of serfs. So there's slavery in Anglo-Saxon England, which you don't tend to get so much post-conquest. So they live on their estates. The king is obviously at the top, and the king moves around like later kings. But it's still very small scale. I mean, it's a world where a 10th century king, Edmund I, actually heard a funny noise in his palace at night, went out to have a look and got murdered by a burglar. You know, it's small scale. It's not the grand Tudor court with sort of 600 people there. But life's very agricultural. They do have trading settlements. A lot of them will probably just be effectively markets on the beach rather than anything more substantial. They don't tend to live in the Roman towns so much. They do start to come back in them later in the period. And so, you know, the buildings are wooden, generally fairly small scale. Not always. I mean, there are some massive halls. Yevering, for example, which is an early Northumbrian royal site, for example, has some vast buildings. But yeah, I mean, England was a very, very prosperous place in the Anglo-Saxon period. So prosperous, in fact, that the Vikings tended to come. And you get kind of a few big waves of Vikings. In the 9th century, there are a huge number of raids, and it ends with King Alfred partitioning the kingdom. So the Danes get the Danelaw, which is sort of the West Midlands and the North. It's kind of a diagonal line down England. So, for example, Oxford is in the Danelaw, as is York up in the North. Then they kind of go away, or they stay in the Danelaw. They stop raiding so much, but they then come back with an absolute vengeance in the 10th century. And by the early 11th century, they're trying to conquer England. And the King Ethelred the Unready, unready as in unread, which means no council. So he's Ethelred. All Anglo-Saxon names mean something. So Ethelred means noble council. And so Ethelred unread is noble council, no council, which effectively means Ethelred the stupid, which is his nickname. So he pays off the Vikings, which obviously doesn't really work because that kind of demonstrates you've got the cash to pay off the Vikings. So they keep on coming back. Eventually, in 1013, he flees to Normandy, and Svein Forkbeard becomes King of England. He then drops dead in 1014. Ethelred comes back. And then in 1016, King Canute, Svein's son, conquers England and marries Ethelred's widow, Emma. So we have a full Danish conquest in 1016. And actually, England is ruled until 1042 by the Danes. So we have this earlier conquest in the 11th century. And I think, you know, it is quite a violent time. You know, there are Danish armies kind of marching around England quite a bit. People seem genuinely scared. On the other side of the coin, of course, Ethelred massacres the Danes in Oxford and in some other parts of the kingdom as well, which doesn't help in the St. Brice's Day massacre. But it is a very unstable period in England, which is to no small part brought about by the Vikings. And it's, you know, today we obviously talk about Viking culture, and, you know, they were also peaceful. They also have a culture, but they were definitely raiders as well.
And all of that history really has shaped England into what it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. What's really interesting, of course, is England was orientated towards Scandinavia in the 11th century, and it's only really the Norman conquest that starts to orientate England back towards France. So that's really interesting, in that, you know, perhaps if the Norman conquest hadn't happened, England and Britain would be a kind of quasi-Scandinavian country today.
Interesting. That's so, you know, I had my DNA tested, and one of the things that came back was I am Scandinavian. Oh, look at me.
But you're actually a Viking. You're actually a Viking. I'm gonna hide the silverware.
I just, you know, when my DNA came back, it was like, I think it was Swedish and Danish. And then, of course, also, I had some English in there. But I think that was it as far as the island went. And that's immediately where my mind went. I was like, oh, I was part of that Dane crew that came over.
Yeah.
I mean, look at my hair.
Fabulous.
I got the red hair and the blue
you look
eyes.
a bit Viking. I could see you sort of going around with an axe and maybe smashing up a monastery, actually.
I would say that sounds fun, but I probably shouldn't say that. Well, we're here to talk about women, and I really want to know from you because you've studied so many women in history. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about women in history?
I think the absolute biggest is that women never have any power, which is rubbish. I mean, I've just written a book on reigning queenship, it'll be out in September. But it's looking at reigning queens throughout time. And I was kind of inspired to write the book because actually I was thinking about female power. And it occurred to me that the very first woman to be elected as a head of state, so head of state as in president rather than prime minister, and to be actually elected rather than a vice president who gets promoted, she's still alive. Which is insane, isn't it? When you think the first man to be elected as head of state is very much definitely not alive, probably died before Christ, I would think. Actually, I thought, that was really fascinating and kind of shocking. So actually, if we want to look at female power, we have to look at reigning queens, because these are the only women who kind of have power in their own right. They're not hiding behind a man. So I think it is a bit of a misnomer that women don't have power. Or, to some extent, they don't do it as well as men. And certainly they often reign differently to men. But I think, we've got some examples of some really powerful reigning queens out there. Elizabeth I, of course, Wu Zetian in China in the 7th century. Japan had 8 reigning empresses who had kind of various amounts of power. But the first Suiko had a great deal of power. So there is female power. We've got some pharaohs in ancient Egypt, and Merneith, who's from the first dynasty, seems to have been very powerful, for example, Hatshepsut, Cleopatra. So there are these women, but they tend to get kind of glossed over almost, or they're seen as exceptions. We kind of think about Elizabeth I as just being an exceptional woman. She's not an exceptional woman. She's a woman in quite an exceptional position for a woman, but, she's a woman she's reigning well, effectively. So I think that's a real misconception, that actually women are boring. They just stay home, they have babies, they don't do anything. And actually history is full of women doing fascinating things.
I love that you study all of history, because I think anybody who's listening or watching today isn't just obsessed with the Tudors. I think it's just you like history in general, but this is maybe the time period that you're focusing on. And I love that you look at all of it. You start talking about the Egyptians, and I think a lot of people go, "Oh, I'm fascinated with the Egyptians."
Well, they should read my book. Definitely read my book, in that it's 5,000 years of reigning women.
Oh, I can't wait for that to come out. Okay, so let's turn to the Tudors, at least for a little bit. I don't want to focus too much on them today, but let's talk about... No, let's not focus on the Tudors. Let's focus on English history for the time. I'm all over the place today. Of queen consorts, let's say that. And if we go back to before they were called queen consorts, we could just say the wife of the king. Who do you think had the most influence or power out of all of them?
Oh, that's an interesting one, and a difficult one. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the wife of Henry II, of course, is incredibly influential. But actually, she spends, I think, 16 years in prison for supporting a rebellion against her husband. So for a large chunk of her life, she's not influential at all. She's locked up in prison. The Lion in Winter, of course, kind of famously hones in on one of the Christmases when she's still a prisoner. But she's incredibly powerful. And under Richard, her son, she's really, really powerful, very prominent. She is an heiress. She owns about a quarter of modern day France in her own right, for example. So she is really important and influential, but it's kind of difficult. Isabella of France, the wife of Edward II, who famously brings an army to England and deposes and probably murders him. She's pretty influential as well, but ends up being forcibly retired by her son. But then you get kind of quiet influence. Philippa of Hainault, the wife of Edward III, for example, they have an incredibly long marriage. He's one of the longest reigning kings. And she's really influential kind of behind the scenes. We have her interceding for people. She's kind of the soft power to Edward's hard power. She kind of, when he's being harsh, she kind of, she's able to come in and go, come on, be a bit more gentle. I'd say she's really influential. So I don't know. It's a really, really hard question. Emma of Normandy, of course, very influential.
Yes.
Elsfrith, very influential. Queen Edith, the widow of Edward the Confessor, is hugely influential. She, the reason Edward the Confessor is a saint is largely down to Edith, in that she commissions a book called The Life of King Edward, who rests at Westminster, which basically says Edward was a saint, and as his wife I really helped him with that. And all the way through, it's, Edward did this, but I helped him. And it's a fabulous piece of propaganda. It's like, he is a saint and I'm pretty much a saint because I'm helping him. So she's influential too. I think if I had to choose one, I'd probably go with Eleanor of Aquitaine, but it's a hard question.
She's such a popular one too.
Yeah, she's fascinating. Of all the medieval women, she's the person who gets the most focus. And actually, I think it's right. We can, to some extent, see inside her head. I mean, she has letters where she writes herself as Eleanor by the wrath of God, Queen of England. Like, nobody else does that. And she lives to be 82, which is an insanely old age for the 12th/early 13th century.
Yeah, I love her. Oh my gosh, yeah. I want to start signing my emails like that.
Yes. I'm going to sign books, actually. Elizabeth by the wrath of God.
You should. I like her. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of those powerful women. I want to know, how did women in society exercise their power when it was dominated by men?
So a lot of it is through men, or on behalf of men nominally. And that's quite important, particularly in the medieval period, that you kind of seem to be acting through a man. The best example of that actually is in the Stephen and Matilda civil war in the 12th century. We have the Empress Matilda. Don't call her Maud. It really, really annoys me when people call her Maud.
Okay.
Don't take her name away. She's Matilda. But anyway, just as a sideline. So we have the Empress Matilda, who is the heiress to the throne. Her cousin Stephen then snatches the throne. And Matilda is pregnant and in Normandy and can't get over for quite a while. Stephen is married to a woman named Matilda of Boulogne, who is also Matilda's cousin. So we have the Empress and then we have the Queen. And Empress Matilda gets a huge amount of bad press for being unwomanly, so she's arrogant. She insists on her supporters meeting her on their knees, for example. She doesn't act in a womanly way. She's acting like a king, which of course she is. Whereas the Queen Matilda of Boulogne, Stephen's wife, gets all the good press. They're like, yep, she's acting, she's a great wife. She's actually more militarily active than the Empress Matilda. So Matilda of Boulogne is raising troops, they're kind of sending them off into battle. But the point is, she does it on behalf of her husband. So that's seen as acceptable power. So actually, if you have a man to hide behind, you can be quite powerful potentially in the medieval period or even in the Tudor period, but it's more difficult to do it by yourself. But women do. So when I wrote the Lives of Tudor Women book, for example, I came across a draper called Catherine Fenkel, who I just love. She wasn't allowed to join the Drapers' Company in London because she's a woman and women can't join. But she actually runs the most successful drapers business in London in the time. She's got her own fleet of ships. She's importing goods. She has apprentices who she takes on in her own name, supports them get the freedom of the city, for example. And when they have a feast at the Drapers' Company, she sits at the top table, and they've borrowed all the silver plate from her house to make the tables look more grand. So she's a great example, and there are still massive bars. It's not equality. She can't be a member of the Drapers' Company, but she's undoubtedly the most successful draper of her generation. So, we do get these powerful women and successful women, but it's a highly patriarchal world. I mean, it still is, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, pre-modern women really struggled to assert themselves, but sometimes they do, and to really great success.
I think to all these women in history who were held back or were shushed, maybe that's the only way I know how to say it. I really look to them for strength sometimes, because how could they sit quietly, or not so quietly, maybe? Is there any part of history that you've studied where you went into it thinking, well, that poor woman, she sat back and she couldn't do anything, and then you researched it and you went, oh, I found stuff that she actually did do?
Yeah, with the Reigning Queens book, and it's kind of sad, more reigning queens aren't successful than are successful across history. It's really not until the 19th century that you start to get routinely successful reigning queens. And generally they fail. Mary Queen of Scots is a great example of the failure of being a reigning queen. Cleopatra VII, of course, kind of fails. She ends up committing suicide, and Egypt getting conquered by Rome. Yeah. So most of them fail, and they do. But I think there's a lot of strength in the attempt. Even if they fail, they've tried. And I think that's important for future women. It shows that women can attempt it. I mean, a good example is Juana la Beltranea, who is the daughter of Henry IV of Castile, well, probably the daughter of Henry IV of Castile, who is the half-brother of the famous Isabel, Catherine of Aragon's mother. And Isabel basically steals the throne from Juana la Beltranea. And it's a kind of, it's difficult because Isabel is someone to be admired too, but she does steal the throne from her niece, who's sort of spreads rumors that she's illegitimate. I mean, it's not helped by the fact that her mother then does go off and have lots of illegitimate children. Doesn't help Juana la Beltranea's case. But actually, the fact that Juana does attempt to take the throne, I think, is quite powerful in itself, because it shows, she knows her position as heiress. She knows she's next in succession, and she does try. And even when she's kind of at her lowest ebb and she's had to give up the throne to Isabel and she's being forced into a nunnery, she's still defiant. Juana signs her name as Juana the Queen for the entirety of her quite a long life. In fact, Ferdinand considers marrying her at one point after Isabel has died.
Okay, so I see the parallels immediately between Juana the Queen, like you said, and Catherine the Queen, after being told to call herself dowager. She was like, nope, not doing it.
They are a family of very powerful women. We've got Isabel of Castile, her niece Juana la Beltranea, her daughter Juana, who the other Juana, who is Queen of Castile and gets locked up for 50 years. She's also, in her own way, she makes attempts. She tries to rule independently, and ultimately she doesn't succeed. But she's a very strong-willed woman. There's no real evidence that she's insane. It's really, it's a classic example of a woman being called insane to try and kind of keep her down effectively. And then, of course, there's Catherine of Aragon, who's just remarkable in her defiance.
She is. I always think of her as the wife of Henry VIII, who had the most influence over him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Catherine comes into it from a position of strength. I mean, she's older than Henry. He's really inexperienced. She's had much more of a political background. I mean, she's got the ambassadorial cipher, for example, for Spain. So she's able to correspond with her father in code, for example, which kind of makes her Spanish ambassador to some extent. Yeah. So she's quite experienced, whereas Henry comes in and doesn't really know what's going on and how to rule. So I think, she is really influential. And gradually the power in the marriage kind of shifts to some extent, but she's always influential and important. And she's right up there with important and influential queen consorts. And it's so sad the way it goes for her. But I mean, had the marriage ended after sort of 20 years, we definitely look back, we still remember Catherine as just, this really important queen consort.
Yeah, we really do. I don't know why it just popped into my head, Margaret of Anjou. I want to know what your take is on her.
So I feel sorry for Margaret. She's another woman who gets a really bad press. I mean, she's the first she-wolf of France, according to Shakespeare, no less. So she's the wife of Henry VI, of course. She's imported to marry him. She doesn't get any say in this. She's simply told, off you go and marry Henry VI. And he's a bit of a disaster as a husband, really, and as a king. So she kind of gradually takes over. Until she's the head of the House of Lancaster and she's raising her troops. In the famous Love Day, where there's a reconciliation between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, she holds hands with Richard, Duke of York, which shows that those two are the leaders, effectively, of their respective parties. But she gets such a bad press. And actually, what was she supposed to do? She has a son by this stage who's heir to the throne. Her husband is the king, and someone's trying to take all of that away. I mean, wouldn't you fight for that? So again, it's a classic example of, if a man was doing what Margaret was doing, they see it as strong. If Henry VI was doing what Margaret does, we see it as strong. But because it's a woman doing it, it's seen as, she's seen as a warmonger. She's seen as arrogant, just, manly to a great extent by her contemporaries and later. And she still gets quite a bad press, to be honest, which is unfair, I would say, because, she's been placed in this situation. And actually, of course, she's going to fight for her child and for her husband. It's understandable.
Some things just never change, do they? You're talking about, women's behavior and how, men perceive it in a way that's not necessarily true. And that's so frustrating.
Yeah, it's like the way women are shrill and hysterical.
Yes.
You hardly ever see a man called shrill. or hysterical.
Never.
And even today, the language we use is really gendered. And sometimes you just have to stop and think, actually, that's not, we shouldn't be saying that. That's really gendered. But so much so, more so for these people who lived in the past.
Yeah. Well, we talked about Catherine of Aragon a little bit, and that, of course, then we think about Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour and the six wives of Henry VIII. But let's set the Tudors aside, and aside from Henry VIII executing two of his wives, were there any other queen consorts in English history who died or were murdered during the reign of their husband?
So some die during the reign, but none are sort of murdered by the husband. Henry is a special case there. I mean, the closest for kind of full-on loathing that we can come to really is Caroline of Brunswick, who's the wife of George IV, so the famous Prince Regent. And they hate each other. I mean, they hate each other immediately. Amazingly, they conceive a child on their wedding night, and he apparently spent most of that night drunk in the fireplace. So who knows how that happened, but they have a child, and this poor girl is kind of passed between these rival homes, and it's just an awful situation. They absolutely hate each other. After their daughter dies in childbirth, and the baby also dies, George tries to divorce Caroline and is never successful in doing it. But eventually it culminates at his coronation. She arrives in all her coronation regalia and finds that Westminster Abbey is locked. She can't get in. So she goes around the Abbey trying all the doors, and eventually goes home and then dies quite soon afterwards. So I think that's probably the closest we can come. I mean, it's quite Henry VIII-esque in that actually they may not be validly married, because George was actually married to a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert, who he married before he married Caroline, and he just goes back to her later on. So,
oh my gosh.
It's an absolute mess. And she's fabulous, Caroline. She's the most eccentric woman. I mean, she probably shouldn't have been queen, really. She's quite eccentric. When she was a teenager, her parents wouldn't let her go to a ball. So they got a messenger halfway through the ball saying, you need to come back immediately. And she was in labour. And called for a midwife and was generally, and then while her parents were absolutely panicking, she just went, that will teach you not to let me go to the ball, and then just got up. And in fact, there was no baby.
Oh my gosh.
So she was quite an eccentric character, was Caroline. There are accounts of her riding around Europe with a pumpkin on her head to cool her head down, for example. So it's hard to know how much of it to take seriously. But she's probably the biggest example of a queen who's mistreated by her husband. It's certainly the most recent one.
Well, now I want to research her even more, because she sounds fascinating.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Well,
she did it. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
She sang a duet. She ran into Napoleon's sister and insisted they sang a duet. And one of her ladies in waiting just says, and that was an event of the 18th century worth listening to. It's just honestly hilarious.
Oh, how fun. I love little anecdotes like that. That's great. I want to shift a little bit to the Stuarts now, because, we're kind of going through history here, but when we come to James the First and Sixth of Scotland, we always want to talk about Anne of Denmark, right? And yeah. I've talked about her and had guests on the show to talk about her, and she has become so fascinating to me. I feel like I always saw her as the wife of James, who was ignored and did nothing, but that's not the case, is it?
No, I mean, I love Anne. I think she's fascinating. No, I mean, she's famously married to a king who's almost certainly gay. I mean, you can never be entirely sure about historical characters, because, I mean, it was generally kept quite secret, but he's pretty clearly gay, and has young male favourites who are very prominent at the court. And she comes to terms with it quite, they actually have quite a happy marriage. It doesn't start off that well. James insists on their eldest son being raised away from her, which causes no end of problems between the couple. To one extent, she turns up outside the castle, Stirling Castle, I think, where he is. And actually, because they won't let her in, she actually has a miscarriage outside the walls of the castle. So she's really distressed by the loss of her son. And actually, when he becomes King of England, she basically says, I'm not coming to England unless you let me take Prince Henry with me. So they do. At first, it's a difficult marriage, but they do come to terms with each other. And actually, the last few decades when they're in England, it's actually really quite a happy marriage, in spite of the fact that they're not exactly a couple, live quite separate lives. But she's fascinating. She's a a massive cultural, she should be more of a cultural icon. She's a huge patron of the arts. I mean, she loves spending money, as did James. She also inherited all of Elizabeth I's dresses, which she sort of had altered to fit her. So she had a pretty splendid wardrobe. But she's really important. And she's also quite interesting in that, you would think if you're a Protestant king and you marry a Lutheran Danish princess, you're on safe ground there. She comes to Scotland, she gets converted to Catholicism by her ladies in waiting.
Yeah.
And so James ends up with this Catholic queen, which is a bit of a liability. But again, she's really discreet about it. She does agree to be crowned in England with James. She doesn't take the sacrament, which is quite a good compromise. Whereas Henrietta Maria, her daughter-in-law, will refuse a coronation because it's a Protestant ceremony. So Anne is quite pragmatic. She's a fascinating character, a huge influence on her children. I mean, Charles I was devoted to her, for example. And she does deserve to be better known. She's a really, really interesting character.
Yeah, I've become more and more interested in her the more that I learn. Was she really as tall as people say? Do you know?
Well, she is Danish.
I am tall. I'm tall.
Yeah, you Vikings. Yeah. I mean, that's apparently so. I mean, Elizabeth's dresses weren't long enough. They had to be lengthened. And Elizabeth was relatively tall for a woman.
Was she?
I think she was taller than me. Isn't she about 5'8" or so, or 5'9"? I think.
Okay.
I think she was quite tall, Elizabeth. I can't remember off the top of my head. Somebody will know, but I think she was quite tall.
Okay. Yeah. I had heard something about Anne of Denmark being over 6 feet.
Yeah, she might well be. I mean, she was definitely tall and kind of stately and good looking, an attractive woman. I mean, she's the only woman that really James seems to have shown any interest in at all, in that they managed to have about 5 or 6 children.
Wow. So all of these queen consorts were highly educated. How important do you think education was into the role that they achieved?
I mean, it's pretty crucial. Languages were really crucial because diplomats will speak to you in Latin or they'll speak to you in French, depending on what period you're in. So actually having a working knowledge of that's pretty crucial. I mean, Catherine of Aragon famously has to talk to Prince Arthur in Latin, for example, because it's their only common language. I mean, why on earth they didn't teach her English, given that she'd been betrothed to him since she was a toddler, is a bit baffling. And possibly he could have had some Spanish lessons too, just to even things up a bit. But, they didn't. So languages are really important. I mean, Anne of Cleves was at a massive disadvantage when she came to England and really only spoke German. And she'd been having English lessons, but actually she still needs an interpreter by the end of her marriage in June 1540. So she was by no means fluent, which is why that famous conversation apparently between Anne and her ladies, where she doesn't know how babies are made, is absolute rubbish, because there's no way she could have that conversation. She can't speak English, and they certainly don't speak German. But languages are really important for education. Some knowledge of accounting is quite important because queens are major landowners. They own huge numbers of lands. They have a life interest in them. It's effectively their jointure or their dower. And some queens are very active in administering them. The most notably Eleanor of Castile, who's the first wife of Edward I and was notorious for her love of finances and lands. There's this contemporary rhyme that goes, the king would like to get our gold, the queen would like our lands to hold, or something like that, where she's after all of their land. She calls in all the debt. She basically takes over the debts of the Jewish moneylenders when Edward I expels his Jewish citizens from the kingdom. And she then calls in all the debts and takes the property that's secured on them. Famously, in fact, an inquiry is taken into her actions after her death. Actually, in one famous example, her bailiffs carried off a couple who hadn't paid their rent to prison and just left their baby in its cradle in the middle of the road.
Oh.
As you do. But finances helped.
So good, so good, so good.
Just in and so good. Thousands of spring finds up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. And that means thousands of fresh reasons to rack.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
Vince, Calvin Klein, Rag & Bone?
Obsessed. Why do we rack? For the hottest deals.
Save on Madewell, Kate Spade New York, Sam Edelman, Joe's, and more. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
So I was just, when I do these interviews, it's the strangest thing because I feel like my mind is all over the place. When I'm listening to you, I have all these weird questions that pop into my head. So they might seem random sometimes to my guests or my listeners, but this is how my brain works. I want to know, out of all the queens in history, which queen do you think was treated the best by her husband, the king, or
Ooh.
emperor, or whoever?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a tricky one. I mean, I think probably Isabel of Castile, who's not really a consort. Well, and she's consort in Aragon, of course, in that she and Ferdinand amazingly kind of create a joint monarchy, effectively. She's probably not as powerful in Aragon as he is in Castile. But they basically come to an arrangement that if one of them does something, the other one will just endorse it. So if that's what the Queen says, then that's what the king agrees. So actually, they're a real partnership. And actually, for all their faults, and both have many, I think they're very effective at ruling Spain. And I do think they're a really effective partnership. And Ferdinand, to some extent, is sort of slight, kind of proto-feminist in that, he agrees that his queen has equal power, which you won't find in most monarchs in the period by any means. So I would say probably Isabel. And partly that's because she comes to it from a position of strength, because Castile's the bigger of the kingdoms in Spain. But I think also they just come to this arrangement and it really works.
I love their story. It does make me wonder, too, if Ferdinand was that way because he had so many daughters, after their son died, if he just realized, okay, my power now lies in my daughters.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't stop him sort of marching into Navarre and sort of stealing his niece's kingdom. So there are limits to that. But yeah, no, I think they're very sold on being succeeded by their daughters. For example, if they don't have a son, then they want their daughters to succeed. And actually, Aragon had the Salic law. So Aragon wouldn't accept a queen. And he changes that so that his daughters can succeed. So I think there is an element of that.
Yeah. I just love powerful women in history. I think it's great. And on that note, when we talk about powerful women, whether they come from the royal family or just a noble, what women in history do you see as remarkable as far as, let's say, their business acumen or how much land they owned?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, queens are major landowners. Bess of Hardwick is the obvious example in England, who's a real businesswoman, who kind of accumulates land through 4 marriages. If you ever go up to Hardwick, it's fabulous. There's glorious Hardwick Hall, which is famously more window than wall, which has got ES carved up in the roofs for Elizabeth Shrewsbury, for her married name. And Bess is obviously Elizabeth, and then she's the Countess of Shrewsbury. But right next to it is another hall that she built, the old hall, which she built and then immediately decided it wasn't grand enough. So just then built a new hall right next to it. Just fascinating. And her financial records are still in Hardwick Hall, which just have remained there since her death. So she's amazing, absolutely fascinating woman. And I think doesn't get as much, she's quite well known, but I think she could do more attention.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like, and that's one female figure from history who I'm intrigued by, but I haven't really looked into her very much or talked to enough guests about her because I feel like there is so much more to be revealed about Bess of Hardwick.
Yeah, I mean, at one stage she accused her husband of having an affair with Mary, Queen of Scots, which you want to know more about.
I'd love it. Mary, Queen of Scots, man. Yeah, I love the history that goes with her because it's so dramatic. There's just so much drama that goes into it, and you can't help but look at it and go, "What was she doing?"
Yeah, and again, I think there's kind of nothing she could have done to salvage her life to some extent. Really, it's all Henry VIII's fault. And a lot of things are Henry VIII's fault. But I think Mary, Queen of Scots is Henry VIII's fault because when she succeeds to the throne, rather than just being a lovely great uncle and going, I'll help, he instead kind of invades Scotland. It's called the Rough Wooing, where he was trying to acquire Mary to marry his son, Prince Edward, which, in many respects she probably would have had a happier life if she'd married Edward, although he obviously dies at 15. But actually, so there's, he invades Scotland to try and take possession of her. And eventually it gets so difficult that she's taken to France. And then while she's in France, being raised as a Catholic, Scotland has a Reformation. So it kind of divorces her from her people and her kingdom. So when she comes back, she's a foreigner. And she doesn't really understand Scotland, and people are suspicious of her because she's a Catholic, and Scotland is very Protestant at the time, with some real firebrand preachers, and John Knox famously, who believes that there's a monstrous regiment of women trying to take over all of Europe's kingdoms, for example. So I think, in many respects, there's not a lot she could have done. Possibly if she'd stayed unmarried, like Elizabeth, because I think the biggest mistake Mary makes, and it's really, really sad, but actually the biggest mistake she makes is giving birth, because the minute there's a prince, nobody really wants a reigning queen anymore, because there's this lovely little prince that they could make king instead. And that's really the beginning of the end for Mary. And it is really sad, but I think it's true. And I think Elizabeth was quite sensible to have remained unmarried.
Yeah. And when you talk about Mary, Queen of Scots, it immediately makes me think of Catherine de' Medici. And I don't know how much you know about her, but she also comes off as one of those very strong women in history. I mean, she went through a lot in her marriage with Henry II.
Yeah, and she didn't have a child for years. Is it 11 years? It's a long time.
Yeah.
So, there was talk of her being sent back to Italy and being repudiated, and so actually had a really difficult time. She was very much second to Henry's mistress, and then comes into her own as Queen Mother, and is such a powerful Queen Mother. I mean, she rules France in the late 16th century.
Yeah, she's amazing too. And I don't know a whole lot about French history, but of course, I always like to look at Henry II just because of the relationship that it has with the Tudors.
Yes.
Because you have to look at the full picture when you're studying history, don't you?
You do. Yeah, you do. And I mean, there's so much interaction. Fascinating period. And it's fascinating to see Catherine de' Medici interacting with Elizabeth and with Mary. She didn't really like Mary, Queen of Scots, very much, in spite of having brought her up, which is a shame for Mary, really.
Yeah. I just had Leanda Delisle on the show to talk about faith and the Tudors. And that episode was such an eye-opener for me to really look at how faith shaped the throne for the Tudors. I mean, you start with Henry VIII, right, forming the Church of England, and how that was like this pivotal point in history where it just really affected what was going to come after, didn't it?
Yeah. And the problem is, I mean, of course, and we can't, it's hard to get our heads around it today because we have a concept of secular. But back then, the church is just so intermeshed with daily life, and they've got no real concept of atheism, for example. There's clearly a God, because effectively they live in a period that's pre-science. So, when the sun rises in the morning, it looks miraculous. The clouds in the sky look miraculous. The seasons of the year. So, of course, there's a God. And if there's a God, then there must be a correct way to worship him. And that's the real problem. They just don't have a concept of toleration as we would have, because actually, surely you have a duty to make sure that everybody worships God in the correct way. And that's really the problem. You get calls for tolerance or toleration from, say, Protestants when they're a minority. And then when they take over, they're not being tolerant back to the Catholics. So, yeah, I mean, the 16th century, I mean, what a mess religion-wise. I mean, England's quite an unusual place in the late 16th century because Catholics are being persecuted rather than Protestants. But,
right.
But they absolutely are. I mean, Elizabeth, it's often said of Elizabeth that, she treads this middle way, and she kind of does. Her church is a bit of a compromised church, but it's not a compromise for Catholics at all, in that it's always illegal to worship as a Catholic under Elizabeth. And the penalties get worse and worse and worse. We have Margaret Clitheroe, who gets pressed to death. And she's not actually pressed to death for harbouring priests. She's pressed to death for refusing to plead guilty or not guilty to harbouring priests, but kind of the same effect, effectively.
Yes. And of course, when we look at women in history too, we have the women who maybe were healers or had a special gift that are immediately considered witches.
Yeah, witches. It's almost always women. And men do get accused in England of being witches, but actually across almost all of Europe, it's mostly women. The exception to that is Russia, where more men than women are accused of witchcraft, which is kind of weird, because we definitely have a stereotype of, the old peasant woman who's a witch. And mostly they do accord with that. You kind of read witch trials and they're often the old woman. I mean, basically some girls start writhing around on the floor and then they go and look for the nearest old woman that they can find who looks a bit witchy. And it's really interesting because, of course, we know that the crime isn't true. But it's a difficult one because not all confessions are necessarily false, because some of these people probably did believe that they were witches, because everybody believes in witchcraft. So it's an interesting one. So they're not necessarily false confessions, except for, of course, we know that, just because you think you bewitched your neighbour's cow, that doesn't mean that you actually have, because of course you haven't bewitched your neighbour's cow.
Right.
But it's a mess. And actually, it's a misnomer that in England, or in England's colonies, that they burn witches. They don't, because Henry VIII turns witchcraft into a felony instead of a heresy, which means it's tried in the criminal courts, which means if you're a witch, you get hanged or imprisoned rather than burned, which is better, I would say.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking, James the First and Sixth is the first one that I really ever heard of doing anything with witches. And to know that Henry VIII also did something. I mean, I guess if I go back to the Wars of the Roses, Jacquetta of Luxembourg was thought to be a witch, wasn't she?
And Eleanor Cobham, who is the sister-in-law of Henry V. So she's a Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester's wife, his lowborn wife, and she gets imprisoned for witchcraft. Yeah. And Joan of Navarre, who's Henry IV's widow, gets imprisoned for witchcraft by her stepson, Henry V.
Wow. So why do you think it is that that such a spotlight has been put on the reign of James the First and Sixth as the guy who went after witches?
I mean, he was really interested in witches. He interrogated the witches in the North Berwick witch trials himself, for example. There's this great illustration of these poor women being caned in front of him so they'll confess. And of course, he wrote a book on it, Demonology. So he was a firm believer, but actually probably everyone believed in witchcraft. Henry VIII certainly did. He makes it a criminal crime, a felony. I think it's really just because James has this specific interest. Henry V imprisons his stepmother, Joan of Navarre, for witchcraft, but actually he was probably after her money. When he's on his deathbed, he orders her to be released, for example, and for her money to be given back to her, which is nice.
Yeah, how convenient now that you're dying.
Yeah, I'm sure she was thrilled.
Oh, Elizabeth, I always love chatting with you because I can ask you anything and you have an answer. And I absolutely love that. And I want you to be able to talk about your book that's coming out in September. And I also want you to talk about your Jane Seymour book, too.
Yeah, so I have, two big projects on the go. So the first one is Women Who Ruled the World, 5,000 Years of Female Monarchy. And that's coming out in September. We've been all good booksellers. I would very much appreciate if people would buy copies, because then I won't get dropped by my publisher. But it's on reigning queens, and it's thematic, so it compares kind of disparate ones. So, for example, Wu Zetian, who's a Chinese empress, the only Chinese female head of state, actually, who's compared with Elizabeth I as kind of successful reigning queens, to kind of work out how you do it. There's a chapter on child queens, which has got Mary, Queen of Scots, of course. It's got Marie and Isabella I of Jerusalem, who have very sad, brief lives. It's got Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, who's the most recent child queen. She becomes queen in 1890. And also Terry Emma Varua of Bora Bora, who's a 19th century child queen. So I've gone global.
Love it.
Which I think you need to do if you're trying to kind of build a model for what works for a reigning queen and what doesn't work. I've got some Aztec queens in there, Mexico queens. I've got a chapter on Japanese empresses. There are 8 reigning empresses. I've got Egyptian queens in there. The only continent, actually, I've got an Australian queen. The only continent I couldn't find a reigning queen in, actually, apart from Antarctica, was South America, unfortunately. Maria of Portugal becomes Queen of Brazil, and she is actually there. But by that stage, she was suffering from quite advanced dementia, so wasn't really reigning. I would I would have liked a South American queen, but otherwise all continents are covered. It was an absolute labor of love. I really enjoyed writing the book, and I hope everyone likes reading it.
Oh, I can't wait.
The second project is Jane Seymour, and this is an academic book that I'm writing on Jane. So it gives me because it's an academic book, it gives me a chance to really delve into topics. So I've been in the archives, deep in the archives with Jane, and I'm trying to firstly myth bust, but also to try and kind of build a picture of what we do know about Jane. And there are huge gaps in her life. I was talking to Rebecca earlier, and I don't know when she was born. I can't find anything. But I have got a lot of new information on Jane, including a new picture, in fact, new contemporary picture. So more will be revealed when that book comes out, hopefully next year, I think. But it's been an absolute thrill. And I'm hoping that people will look at Jane in a different way. She's not always not likable. Sometimes you just think, oh, Jane, what are you doing? But she's much more human, I think. And that's what I've been trying to do. She's not simply the queen who sort of comes along and says, bound to obey and serve, and then sits quietly until she drops dead.
Yeah, the last time we talked about her, I think I said, I have a feeling she was a lot more like her brothers than we think.
She's very Edward Seymour, actually. I mean, she almost certainly would have been regent for Edward had she lived. I mean, certainly that she's named as regent in the second act of Succession. And so her brother Edward wouldn't have got a look in, it would have been Jane. And can you imagine what she would have done? I think we'd have an entirely different view of Jane had she lived into Edward's reign. And it's actually really sad that she didn't. She gets a lot of hate. Largely due to the circumstances of her queenship. I mean, unfairly so, actually. In that, I mean, I suspect she didn't know that Anne Boleyn would be beheaded. I mean, Anne Boleyn didn't know she was going to be beheaded until quite soon before it actually happened. And I mean, would you want to set a precedent of your fiance executing his wife, beheading his wife? Because I wouldn't. I mean, that's not a precedent I would want. So I think we can exonerate her from that. There's no evidence at all that she wanted Anne to be beheaded. But she does get a lot of hate, and I'm trying to just, I think she's actually quite sad. It's a sad life. It's a life that's half lived. She dies so young, and she dies when her child is 12 days old. So he grows up without a mother. So it's quite a sad story. And there's so much promise. She could have been so much more than she was. So I hope people enjoy the book. I mean, I've loved it. I'm sort of deep into Jane's story. And I'm not sure I'll ever leave it alone to some extent. Kind of keep looking.
Yeah, I said earlier how much I appreciate the fact that you researched the Seymour family because they are so overlooked.
Yeah, and they're so influential. I mean, they're more influential than the Boleyns, arguably long term. I mean, Edward Seymour's the architect, along with Thomas Cranmer, of the Protestant Reformation. Arguably, Thomas Cranmer and Protector Somerset, Edward Seymour, are the fathers of the Church of England as we know it to some extent. So yeah, they do get really overlooked, and they're not always. I mean, they're very into money, the Seymours, which I think comes across quite a lot. But they're fascinating, and they're a family that really come from nothing. I mean, Jane's father's main office is hereditary warden of Savernake Forest, which is not very prominent, to be honest. And they go from that within a generation to being queen. His grandson's a king. His son's the Lord Protector of England. I mean, amazing stuff.
Yeah.
They're a fascinating family.
Well, and the Duke of Somerset, current day, is a Seymour.
Yes, descended from Edward Seymour by his first wife, Catherine Filial, who's somewhat scandalous.
I love that story. Oh, Elizabeth, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your vast knowledge of women in history with us.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, I could talk all day, so thank you for inviting me on.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.